Welcome to Fast Starting a Career of Consequence. I'm Kelly Morrissey, the Managing Director of the Center for Continuing Education at Yale Divinity School, and I'm so glad that you've joined us today for what promises to be a rich and informative webinar with our very special guest, Fred Siever. If this is your first time joining us, I'd encourage you to visit our website to see our various programs and upcoming events, and we'll drop that URL in the chat. Please remain muted throughout the presentation. We'll have a time of Q&A following Fred's presentation, so if you have any questions for Fred, please post them in the Q&A. We've enabled the live transcript feature, so if you don't want to see the subtitles, just go to live transcript at the bottom of your screen and select Hide Subtitles. Now it's my honor to introduce Fred Siever. Fred started his career as a teacher, later entered the insurance business and retired in 2007 as president of New York Life Insurance Company, a Fortune 100 corporation. Following his retirement, Fred attended Yale Divinity School and was awarded a master's degree in religion in 2011. He's published 3 books and has been writing and speaking about his faith and business experience since he graduated from YDS. His newest book, Fast Starting a Career of Consequence, Practical Christ-Centered Advice for Entering or Re-entering the Workforce, is very timely and relevant given the large number of Americans reimagining their future as they re-enter the workforce. So Fred, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. I hope that Megan will be able to share the slides that I sent over. Oh, she's doing that now. Terrific. Yeah, so I've entitled the presentation Fast Starting a Career of Consequence, which is in effect the title of my book, the most recent book. And I sort of put the subtitle of Providential Book Journey on here because I want to talk to you about sort of God's providence in this process of going through this book. And I'm also going to talk about the content of the book to some extent. But I'm not here to sell books, even though I'll spend a little time just recapping the books that I've written, just very, very briefly. So Megan, if you go to the next slide, we'll get started. Yeah, here's an outline of what I'm going to cover today. I'm going to talk very briefly about my own personal faith journey. I'm going to mention my retirement pursuits. I retired, as Kelly said, in 2007, so I've been retired for 14 years now. I'm going to mention again in just one slide in a couple of minutes, mention the genesis and themes of my 3 books. And then most of the time is going to be spent here on sections 4 and 5, where I talk about God's presence on the journey, the book journey, and then mention the biblical principles and business tips, that some of the ones that are inherent in the 3rd book. Next slide, Megan. So in terms of my my faith journey, I think my testimony actually, I think, is more powerful than many because I was not raised in a worshiping Christian family. I came to know the Lord through friends and almost independently. And it initially started with what I'm calling a mystical adolescent experience at age 12. I grew up in a neighborhood as a baby boomer with a lot of different faiths represented and many, many children on my block. And we spent a lot of time talking about some pretty heavy things. And here I was age 12 and I was home alone one day lying on my bed and my parents were working. My brother was out playing and I started contemplating all these questions in my mind of what the confusion I had over what I heard from my friends. Who is God? Did he really create everything from nothing? Who's this guy, Jesus? What's this about the Trinity? Is God going to be with me now and forever? Those kinds of questions. And I felt myself as I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't self-hypnotized, but I was in this mystical kind of environment where I really felt palpably felt God's presence, but I also felt myself being lifted off the bed, almost in an out-of-body experience and feeling like I was in God's hands. And what he was saying to me, not audibly, but I really felt there was communication going on where he was saying, yes, I am with you now. I will be with you always, and answers to your questions will come over time. And that experience gave me an enduring faith and really a desire to learn a lot more, and started me really along my Christian journey, which has lasted a lifetime. And even right up to retirement, where I retired early to pursue what I'm calling a lifelong dream to go to divinity school. So if you go to the next slide, Megan, I'll talk about that a minute. These are my retirement pursuits. At age 59, I went off to Yale Divinity School. Took 4 years to do a 2-year program because I was busy with a lot of other stuff that you could see on this slide. I was teaching business school classes at Fairfield University on leadership and strategy. I was serving on 2 public boards, 5 nonprofit boards, one of them including late in my Yale career, joined the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, and I'm still on that board. So it's been 10 or 11 years that I've been on that board. And I was mentoring then and continue to mentor a number of young executives and wrote 3 books. And in terms of the Yale experience, I just want to mention a couple of things. First of all, I'll never forget my first day of school at age 59. I was leaving my house in Connecticut to drive up to New Haven, and my oldest daughter was visiting us with her daughter. And as I went out the front door, she yelled out to me, "Dad, play nice with the other kids and don't forget to share." Well, that was funny, but it was in a way kind of profound because that experience at Yale really was all about spiritual sharing. And I really felt that I was embraced there. You know, despite my age, I was embraced there and I had a wonderful experience. In fact, how many people do you know, or how many of you say you're happy every day? And as I sat in those classes at Yale, I kept telling myself how happy I was to be there. And after I graduated in 2011, 2013, the Wealth Channel magazine, they knew about my background in insurance. The Wealth Channel magazine asked me to write an article about retirement planning. And I'm sure they thought I was going to talk about financial planning. I didn't talk much about financial planning at all. I talked much more about following your passions and utilizing your skills. And I entitled that article, "Happier, Healthier, and Younger in Retirement," because that's exactly how I felt at the time. That's exactly how I feel now. And you can't help being happy if you're following God's calling. Next slide, Megan. These are the 3 cover shots from the books that I've written. There's actually a 4th, which is a workbook that goes along with the most recent book. But let me start in the upper left here. God Revealed was my first book. The genesis of that book was a dinner I had with my daughter, Dina, and her husband, in which I was telling them, I was still at Yale at the time, I was telling them stories about interesting experiences I had throughout my life and work life, family life, etc. Not all of them faith-based, but at the end of it, Dina said to me, "Dad, you know, you've probably told those stories to thousands of New York Life agents and employees, and many of them you haven't even told to your own family." She said, "You really should memorialize them in writing, at least for the family." And, that hit me pretty hard because it actually was true. And so, I started writing the stories and ultimately ended up with 31 of my personal encounters with God over the course of my life. The subtitle of the book was "Revisit Your Past to Enrich Your Future," because I wanted people not to read it as my memoirs so much as reading it as a memory trigger of their own encounters with God. And that's the way, if you read some of the Amazon reviews, you'll see that people appreciated that. The book on the right, my second book, Grace Revealed, subtitle of that book is "Finding God's Strength in Any Crisis." That came about as a result of the presentations and speaking engagements I had coming out after writing my first book, radio, TV, some large groups and many, many small groups. And it was in those small groups where I got to hear stories. As I told my stories, it gave people permission to tell me their stories. And I heard these compelling stories of people who were in deep crisis of one form or another and only got through it through their faith. And in each case, I actually had about 40 stories that I had written about these folks. And I only published 19 of them. And I chose the 19 because every one of them followed the same pattern of being in deep crisis, whether it was addiction or sexual abuse or terminal illness, whatever it was, crying out to the Lord, realizing God's grace, and then going into Christian service of some kind out of their gratitude. So that's sort of the pattern of all those stories. Two of them were read, the book was read by a producer at the 700 Club, and they actually sent a video crew out to videotape those two stories. And when they ran them as featured stories on their show, they had over 8,000 prayer requests for each one immediately after the story was told. So they certainly it was impacting a lot of lives. The third book at the bottom here is the one we're going to talk most about. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that in a minute. So let's go to the next slide, Megan. So we're already up to part 4 of the presentation. So this is where we're going to spend most of our time. I want to talk about God's presence on this journey because it's pretty amazing. God's hand has been in this, and there's been so many providential experiences that I really want to share. My passion really has been to positively impact the lives of others by speaking and writing about my faith and my business experience. And that's now really become a calling as opposed to just a passion. And I feel called to do this. And in fact, this third book, Fast Starting a Career of Consequence, has really been a blessing to write and to go through the process because it integrates both my faith and my business experience in a single book. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Next slide. Yeah, I want to tell you about the genesis now of this third book, Fast Starting a Career of Consequence. It started back when I was still at New York Life. My daughter, Dina, had graduated from Calvin College. She found a job. The job market was very tough. She found an entry-level position in a big global cosmetics firm. And she was basically fulfilling marketing orders within the marketing department. And after a few months, she came to me and said, Dad, this is really getting boring. I need to show them I could add some value. I want to build a career out of this, not just these menial tasks that I'm doing. She says, can you give me some tips? So I thought long and hard. I prayed about how I might notice someone within New York Life as president of the company, how I might notice somebody deep down in the organization as an employee that has really high potential. So I came up with 5 tips that I talked to Dina about. She implemented them. She even went beyond what I suggested and did very well, was promoted several times in the subsequent years. I also used those tips in 3 college commencement addresses I did and got a lot of very positive feedback. I ended up writing a really short article about those 5 tips, and it got published. And then when it was published, somebody at marketwatch.com, which is a very big blog. They say they get 20 million visitors a month. They got a hold of me and they said, we read your article. We love your tips, but we really would like you to expand upon tip number 5 and we'll run it in the blog. So they did. And, it got a lot of impressions and a lot of feedback. And my literary agent, who at the time I hadn't spoken to in probably a year, gave me a call. He read the blog and he said, Fred, you've got another book here. And I said, well, I hadn't really thought about that, but, you may be right. I'll give it some thought. And I said to him, but, I'm going to have to talk about my faith in this book. And he said, of course, it's in your DNA. And that was the genesis of this book, Fast Starting a Career of Consequence. Next slide, Megan. So let's talk about some of the providential aspects of this book publication. First of all, the publisher. I was speaking to the publisher in December of last year. The book was not, the manuscript wasn't fully complete, so I hadn't even submitted it yet, but I was talking to the team that represents me at the publisher, and we went through a lot of things, cover design and release date and so forth. When they told me the release date, this was December of last year, and they said that your release date's going to be in August. of 2021. And I thought, boy, that's a long time off. And I said something like, can't we do it sooner? Well, they went through a whole argument of why we couldn't do it sooner. And it was somewhat logical. And then I said, but people are looking for jobs now. At that time, I thought the pandemic was going to be over. And I said, I really want to get some books that I can sell on my website. And they said to me, the leader of the team said, well, we think we could get you some books in June. And the thing that happened in the middle of that conversation is the CEO of the publishing firm was on the call. And he jumped in because he totally understood the timeliness and the relevance of the topic. And he said, no, we're going to get Fred books in the middle of March. And so they made this concession to get the books in the middle of March, and they did. They lived up to it. And the reason I'm calling this providential is my contract with the publisher that gives them 0 royalties for books that I sell on my website. And they knew that, and yet they got me the books early. So I really felt God was in that outcome, which I did end up selling a few thousand copies through my website in advance of the official release. Next slide, Megan. This may be even more remarkable, and that is, I was president of New York Life, but I retired in 2007. And this spring, I got a call from one of the sales managers who ran a big office in Dallas, second biggest New York Life office in the country. He had some 300 or 400 agents in that office. And he got a hold of me via email, and he said, Fred, I'd like you to speak to my agents. Well, I thought to myself, this is a secular organization. They all knew about my faith when I was working there, but I thought, I'm not sure. I've been gone 14 years. Are they really going to want me to talk about my faith? So anyway, I did the presentation. I also built into it some discussion of my reflections on my days at New York Life. And after I did that, and by the way, he bought 200 books to give with his own money, not with the company money, to give to his agents. And as a result of that, he spoke to a number of the other people, his colleagues throughout the country who were also running sales offices, and he told them about it. I ended up doing 13 such presentations, and each office bought at least 50, many of them 100 or more books. So it really ultimately ended up impacting a lot of people. The other point on this slide is I'm currently on the holding company board that owns 3 operating insurance companies, also a secular organization. And I was talking to the CEO. We have a periodic phone call together because I'm a director of his company. And we're talking one-on-one about strategy in the business. And he asked me about the book. I didn't even bring up the book. He asked me, and I told him the story about New York Life. And he said, Fred, I'd like you to speak to our agents. And again, I'm thanking the Lord for this revelation. I mean, these are secular organizations. And he arranged a Zoom call with 6,000 agents on the call, where I did a presentation where I talked not only about the books, but also about my experience as a director of the company. So that was another providential event. Go to the next slide. This slide, MarketWatch.com, comes back to me after they heard about the book. This was only a month ago. They got a hold of me and they said, we'd like you to write an article that basically talks about what kinds of consideration one needs to take when they're looking at reimagining their career. They were thinking about people coming through COVID-19, reimagining their career. And then at the end of the article, you can talk about some of the business tips from your book. And right at the end, they said to me, by the way, you really need to make it purely a secular article. Well, I thought about objecting to that, but then I said to myself, well, wait a minute. My passion is to impact people's lives. I can do this in a secular way. So I wrote the article. I submitted it to them. And lo and behold, they get back to me and they said, it's so remarkable that a Fortune 100 company president would go to divinity school. We'd like you to say more about that in the article. So, here they went from totally secular to me talking about my divinity school experience. So I found that remarkable. But then another interesting thing happened. When they did the article, they put the title on it. I didn't come up with the title, they did. I wrote the article. And the title they initially put on it was, here's 3 questions you need to answer if you're reimagining your career or your future. That's not the exact words, but it was 3 questions you need to answer. A week later, they ran the article again, which really surprised me. Exactly the same article, didn't change a word, but the heading they put on it was, I was a Fortune 100 corporate president who retired early to go to divinity school. So I'm not exactly sure why they ran it a second time, but I love the fact that they mentioned divinity school right in the heading of the article. Again, God's presence in this whole process. The next slide. Now, this one started way back at the beginning, and I wanted to talk about the market for the book. Because when I first started writing the book, publishers will tell you, be pretty tight about how you define your market. Even if it happens to be small, tightly define your market. So initially, when I submitted the book proposal, I said my market was Christian college students, and the subtitle was going to be Practical Christ-Centered Advice for Entering the Workforce. Then I started thinking about it as I was writing the book, that there are adults coming off child rearing years, and there's veterans coming back from the military. So I changed the subtitle to include re-entering the workforce. And then, of course, COVID-19's causing millions of people to re-enter the workforce. So this market suddenly is expanding way beyond Christian college students. And then the amazing thing is the book, like I said, it released officially in August, but the Kindle version was available for about 4 or 5 months before that on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. So if you went on Amazon, even before the book was released, there were about 40 customer reviews, reader reviews, and at least half of them, you could go on there now, and I think it's still the case, at least half of them emphasize the fact that this book is not just for Christians because of the value of the business advice. So this was a remarkable expansion in the ultimate market for the book. And again, a providential experience. Next slide. Okay, so let me give you some of the content of the book quickly. The book has 5 chapters on biblical principles in the workforce and in the workplace, and it has 10 chapters on fast starting tips. And I expanded upon the 5 I originally gave to my daughter, Dina. And the interesting thing about the book is that the biblical principle, it's very integrated. I mean, it really was a blessing to write this book because it's integrated. The chapters on biblical principles talk a lot about workforce examples, workplace examples, and the chapters on the business tips are loaded with scriptural references and biblical principles. So let's go to the next slide and I'll talk about that a little bit. So the first chapter of the book, all of my books, the first chapter I consider extremely important. And so this one I talk about, this is in the biblical principles section. The title of the chapter is Identify and Utilize Your Spiritual Gifts at Work. I really believe that all of us have a combination of spiritual gifts, and we need to use them. I mean, I confess in the book that early in my life, in my career, I felt like on Sundays I was a Christian, on Saturdays I was a family man, and during the week I was a corporate executive. Well, truth is, you're all those things all the time. And so you need to incorporate spiritual gifts, your spiritual gifts, in what you do at work. So initially, as I wrote this chapter, I remember doing a spiritual gift assessment test or tool several years before at church. Many of you may have done the same thing, a little booklet where you answer 70 questions and you score it, and it kind of zeroes in on what your spiritual gifts are. And it's pretty good. It's pretty dependable. I mean, it hit me pretty much on the nose. And I had been speaking to a guy named Darren Shearer, who's in the business school at the Houston Baptist University. And he owns his own publishing company. So he wanted to publish his book. So we went back and forth, and we became friends and did a lot of emailing back and forth. I didn't use him to publish the book, but what I did when I got to writing this chapter and thinking about it, I thought about that assessment tool, and I called Darren and I said, I can't seem to find this assessment tool that I used at my church. And I know a lot of other churches that have used it. Do you happen to know how I can find the author and ask for permission to use it in my book? And he says to me on the phone, Fred, you have my permission. And I said, what? He said, I wrote that book. He said, I published that book. And so he gave me permission, and it's in Appendix A of the book as this spiritual assessment tool. A lot of people have said they really appreciate the fact that it's in the book. So anyway, my gifts were really a strong faith that started there at age 12, leadership and financial acumen. And I talk in this chapter, I give several examples of how that was used, by those skills were used in my work life. Next page. Okay, here's the other 4 chapters within the biblical principles section. I'm only going to talk about the first chapter, but I highlighted chapter 3, Jesus as a workplace partner, because that chapter, a lot of people have said they really appreciated that chapter and the scriptural references in it and the reliance I placed on the Holy Spirit in my own work. And that's why I highlighted it. But I also these other chapters also have some valuable insights in how to apply your spiritual gifts and how to bring biblical principles into the workplace. Next slide, Megan. Okay, now I'm into the section on the fast start tips, the business related tips. Chapter 7 is entitled Understand and Embrace the Company's Mission. When I was talking to Dina, this was one of the tips I gave Dina. I said to her, I'd like you to read the company's mission, also their vision statement. I'd like you to memorize the mission statement, memorize it so that you can actually recite it. And she said to me, Dad, you really want me walking around reciting the mission? And I said, not really. No, I don't want you to do that, because you'll appear arrogant if you do that. There are other ways to let people know you understand the mission, but you shouldn't be reciting it. But the reason I want you to be able to recite it is because then it becomes embedded in your brain. And if it's embedded in your brain, you can quickly assess kind of the decisions that are being made by your superiors or your colleagues, or even as you advance in the company, your own decisions against the mission of the company. Because I think it really is critically important for companies to remain true to their mission, and that the employees understand that and are making the tough decisions with that in mind. So that was one of the tips I gave Dina. If you go to the next slide, the next 2 slides are the final 2 tips I'm going to talk about. And by far, in my view, these are the 2 most important. These are the 2 tips that will get any new employee recognized as a high potential individual. And Dina worried as I told her about these 2 tips, because she never took a business class, never took an economics or an accounting class. I don't think she even took a math class in college. So the first one here was I want people to develop and demonstrate strategic thinking capability. Dina said to me, when I said that to Dina, she says, Dad, I don't even know what you're talking about. And I said, well, let me explain. The word strategy, the etymology of the word strategy it was originally a war term. It was about defeating the enemy. And I said, the business analog to that really is about beating the competition. And strategy is all about how you achieve sustainable competitive advantage. Well, how do we do that? How are you going to do that, Dina? And I said, here's the first thing you got to do is get an understanding of your company's products, services, what their customer base is and who their targeted markets are, and identify their core competencies and competitive advantages. Now, you could do that by reading all the public information that's available, by asking around the company, by getting a copy of the strategic plan. This chapter of the book talks about all the ways in which you can develop that strategic thinking capability. And in fact, there's one page in that chapter that has a list of 8 questions. If you ask those questions, they're all strategic questions you could ask about your own company or any company you decide to join. And I said to her, then finally, once you get a pretty good understanding of your company, then do the same with the competitors. Find out who the top 4 or 5 competitors are and track them, see what they do, read the publicly available information. And she went a step further. She started buying their products. Well, she worked for a cosmetic firm, so it was easy and not expensive to buy their products. I mean, if you're working for an auto manufacturer, it's a little different story. But she did a study of that, and really it developed that skill. A lot of people think you're born with strategic thinking capability. I don't buy that. I think you have to develop it. Next slide, Mike. Okay, this is the last slide on these tips. This is the one that MarketWatch.com said it was tip number 5 that they wanted me to expand upon. And this was the one that was the hardest for my daughter to grasp, because I said, you really need to get a fundamental understanding of the financial underpinnings of the business. And she said, well, Dad, how do I do that? And I said, first, find somebody in the accounting department who's willing to just give you, a high level understanding of the income statement and the balance sheet. The income statement reports the results for the period. It's got the revenues and expenses and net income. The balance sheet is a snapshot in time of the assets, liabilities, and net equity. And I said, just get a basic understanding. You don't need to know how all these numbers are calculated. All you need to know is how the income statement flows into the balance sheet. And once you do that, I said, I want you to track 6 numbers on a quarterly basis. Her company published quarterly results. And I said, track 6 key numbers on one spreadsheet, quarter after quarter after quarter. And the numbers are this: 3 numbers from the income statement, total revenues, total expenses, and net profit. Those 3 numbers. And 3 numbers from the balance sheet: assets, total liabilities, net equity. Track them every quarter. It'll take you 2 minutes at the end of a quarter to grab the income statement and balance sheet and put those 6 numbers in your spreadsheet. And then you can watch the trend lines, what's happening to those numbers over time. And you'll be able to ask questions about patterns you see. At some point, you'll probably get more sophisticated with it and look at it by business unit, but start with just the total company. And you'll actually have a good feel for where the revenues and the profits are. And I said, unlike anybody at your company in your peer group, nobody's going to do this. In fact, very few people in the company, except for those in the accounting or finance department, look at these numbers. And I said, it's really going to be key to do this. And I said to her, even at New York Life, I had 10 or 12 people reporting to me. If I was at a staff meeting, I said, somebody tell me what our revenues were last quarter. I'll bet you nobody in the room could even come close. They probably couldn't, within $10 million, they probably couldn't tell me the revenue for the quarter. And here you are buried down in the organization, and you're watching these numbers. And I said, then after you get a feel for these numbers, go back to the accounting guy and say, ask what I'm calling the killer question. In fact, MarketWatch.com called the title of the article the killer question. I said, the killer question is this: what drives the profitability of this business? And he should be able to tell you some key metrics that drive the profitability of the business. Now, he might say, I'll have to get back to you on that. He might give you an answer. But, it's an important thing to understand and to know. Collins wrote about it in his book, Good to Great. And I said, I wouldn't be surprised if the CEO of the company heard that some young girl in the company down the marketing department was asking questions like that, and you know what? He did hear about it. And her career flourished after doing this. Next slide, Megan. All right, I'm going to try and close up here pretty quickly. Well, here's the other 7 fast start tips. Sorry, I thought we were on the last slide. These are the other 7 fast start tips. I've highlighted here 3 chapters. I won't read them all to you, but that people have told me really were fantastic chapters. The one on taking charge of your own development, chapter 13, make every presentation to command performance. And chapter 15 was kind of my bookend to the book. You know, chapter 1 was identifying your spiritual gifts. Chapter 15, balance, faith, family, and career. And people have told me those have been great chapters. What surprised me about this was chapter 13. When I wrote chapter 13, I did presentations at New York Life multiple times a week. And many times it was different presentations during the week. And I decided to lay out very clearly how I prepared for that. Because, you know, it's one of the biggest fears people have is presenting in front of a crowd or a group. And so I laid out in exquisite detail how I prepared for those presentations. And a whole bunch of people have told me that was their favorite chapter. I thought it was going to be the least favorite chapter, you know, because of the level of practical detail that's in it. But, you know, I'm very pleased that people found it to be interesting. Last slide. Next slide. Okay. I threw this slide in here because, you know, I've often talked about this in when I taught business school classes. And, you know, I really view the single most important key to business success is simultaneous top line and bottom line growth, simultaneous. And, you know, I tell people, I won't say this to you today, but I've often said, if you remember nothing from my presentation, this is the most important thing to remember. And it's true whether you're in a big company, a mid-sized company, a small company, or you're starting up a new entrepreneurial company. You need to find a way through your strategies and your initiatives to achieve simultaneous top line and bottom line growth. And in the insurance business that I was in, it's real easy to get top line growth. All you really have to do is reduce your prices, increase your payment to your distributors, and relax your underwriting standards, and you'll get tremendous top line growth, but it'll be at the expense of the bottom line. Conversely, it's easy to get bottom line growth if you don't care about the top line, you know, by doing the opposite. And the example I'd love to give is a board I was on called Express Scripts. Some of you will have a prescription card in your pocket or in your wallet or your purse for Express Scripts pharmaceutical benefit. And I was on their board. New York Life bought that company in 1994 for $3 million, all in. The company, the property, all the assets, $3 million. New York Life never put another penny into the company. And 25 years later, that company was number 22 on the Fortune 100 list. And it had over 60 billion of market capitalization. It went from 3 million to 60 billion in 25 years. And it was largely attributable to their founding CEO, who was with them for quite a while and generated that kind of growth. And, you know, he was a phenomenal CEO. I learned more from him than he ever learned from me. And I was on his board, and the thing that he had an elevator speech when you asked him what his plans were. I mean, he had detailed plans, but he also had this elevator speech where he said, if you asked him what his plan was, he said 30% top line growth and 30% bottom line growth every year. And he did it. And that's how he went from 3 million to 60 billion. So I see Kelly's popped up. We want to try and take some questions, Kelly. But that's the end of my remarks. I hope you've learned something from it. And I'm watching God to see how he providentially works through the rest of this book process. Thanks for joining me.
Okay, Fred, we have some questions for you.
Okay.
And the first is, how would you say Divinity School helped you in the business world?
Well, you know, Divinity School was after I retired. But I would say it did help me in my board service, certainly. particularly my public board service, because there often can be contention in those kinds of meetings, especially in a difficult environment like the COVID environment. And I think it gave me a real appreciation, a better ability to listen, a better ability to try and demonstrate humility and gratitude. I think it was those things at the Divinity School because, I'll be honest, given my background, I was probably more conservative than most at the Divinity School, fairly liberal university. But you know what? I found that to be a wonderful blessing because I love the diversity. And I think probably the Divinity School experience helped me a lot in terms of the kinds of what they now call, ESG and DE and I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and those kinds of things were very important to me in both in business and in my board service. So it was just a much more realistic recognition of the humanity of mankind and how we have to treat each other.
Okay. How did you use your position of influence and power to implement Christian principles to help the most destitute and marginalized populations while adhering to your fiduciary duty to the shareholders to maximize profit?
Well, if anybody picked up my first book, they'd see some examples of that. I'll tell one quick story. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but there was a lot we did at New York Life that reached out to the other population in terms of trying to educate. We put in a whole system of financial literacy that we started with Black churches, African-American churches, not really to sell insurance, but to educate them. We set up at New York Life an LBGTQ networking group, even though some members of the executive team felt like we shouldn't do that. I kind of overruled some of the objections to that. But I had an experience at a big agent meeting. This probably was the most profound experience I had, maybe in my life, and certainly in my working life, where I was at a $1 Million Roundtable meeting, which is a meeting of 7,000 agents from around the world who qualify for membership every year, representing 200 companies. And they had an award that was called the Real Life Stories Award, which talked about people who were benefited from insurance. And I went to that meeting as a guest. I was in the audience, and they showed a video of the winning submission of that Real Life Stories competition. And as I'm watching it, it was very moving. It was about a woman who, young adult whose husband applied for insurance on a Friday, was killed in an automobile accident on Sunday, 2 days later. And, she talked about the kids, 2 young kids, and how it paid for their insurance and or paid for their mortgage and paid for the kids' education. It was very moving, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house, but the tears were rolling down my face for a different reason. And that was that case had come across my desk several months before this. And it came with a file from the legal department that said, we recommend you deny this claim. And the reason was, and by the way, it's the only claim I was ever asked to opine on as an executive at the company. And the reason was there was never any premium paid initially with the application. So 2 days after the guy filled out the application, the insurance was not yet in force. And I just looked at the file and decided the right thing to do is to pay the claim. And so I overrode the claim, or the recommendation of the legal department, paid the claim, and later did some research to find out that this wasn't just a once in a month or once in a week activity at New York Life. We were paying 300 death claims a day. So it gave me a better understanding of the of the business I was in, but it also, this was a message from God to me, because I was challenging my, the value of what I was doing for a living. And this was like a pure message from God in front of this audience where nobody else knew the rest of the story except me. And I was the guy who paid the claim. And then, Kelly, that gave me a chance to tell the story in more detail than I've told it here to thousands of agents and employees. And I told the story in the way I told you, that this was a message from God about the value of what we do. And a number of agents, many agents, resonated with that story and told it to their own clients as they went out in the marketplace. So I took a lot of time to tell that, but it was such a moving experience for me. It's hard to describe.
So Fred, one of our participants today is a gemologist who actually has transitioned to New York Life as an agent over the past 2 years, and wants to know, as a female in the industry that's predominantly managed by mostly men, what advice do you have for a female to become successful?
Yeah, well, even when I was at New York Life, we made a big push to recruit more female agents. And so I think the opportunity is actually greater for females. And I don't want to say any remarks that might appear sexist, but I truly believe, in selling insurance, the most important thing is that you have a trusted agent who can relate to people and relate to the client. And I think many women, not only do they control the finances in a household, but the women who are agents, what I found historically is that they tend to come across as a much more trusted advisor. So I think that the opportunity is actually greater for women. And there've been a number, since I retired, I think there've been a number of New York Life agents who won the prize as the top agent in the country, who were female. And that had never happened years ago. But I think it was a real revelation that the women's market and women as agents can do much better. Now, also, one of the boards I'm on, the RGA, the Reinsurance Group of America, which is also an insurance company, but it's reinsurance. The CEO is a woman. More than half of the directors of the company are women. And the direct reports to the CEO, about half of them are women. So, it's changing. The ceiling is lifting. And I think it's a good time to be a woman in the business. I really do.
Okay. So another question that we have is, what are the 6 key numbers to know for balance and income statements?
Okay, well, I'll repeat what I said earlier, that, if you really don't want to dig into the details, just look at total revenues, total expenses, net profit on the income statement, a balance sheet, assets, liabilities, and net equity. Now, if they're looking for the drivers, your prior questioner, we took a look at the book Good to Great, and back when I was at the company, and we asked people what are the drivers of the success of this business. And your other questioner, who was an agent at New York Life, might be surprised, but the one that came out the most from my staff, my top staff, was case rate. In other words, an agent selling insurance, if they can get their case rate up, the number of new policies that they're selling every year, that can snowball into more leads and greater sales and success for the agent. So that really, it actually kind of surprised me a little bit that was kind of one of the key metrics that defined the success of the business was the agent's ability to sell more cases.
Okay. And Fred, How do the principles in your book apply for those working in the nonprofit sector?
Well, frankly, I think they even apply more to the nonprofit sector, especially the biblical principles, because one of the things at New York Life that moved me the most was every year I'd have to, or I was honored to present checks to nonprofit organizations from our New York Life Foundation, and hearing their stories about their passion for what they do and the people that they're serving is just very compelling. But even the principles I just told, I told my daughter Tina, she also has now started her own nonprofit and has been on the board of several nonprofits. And she tells me, those principles apply equally well in nonprofits. Now, some of them have very lean staffs, very small staffs. So in that sense, some of it may be a little different, but I think they absolutely apply. Um, as you look through the list, how important is the mission? I talked about the mission today, very important. Understanding the financials, that's something that's quite weak in many nonprofit organizations. And you can really stand out and benefit not only the nonprofit, but its constituents if you get those financials right and you understand them. And strategies, it may not be so much about beating the competition as it is just finding a way to penetrate the audience and the markets that you intend to help through the nonprofit. So I'd say, basically all of them. Certainly the one at the end, the balancing faith, family, and career is I go through all of my own coping techniques, I call them, for dealing with a very intense job and at the same time giving time to your family and your faith.
Right, right. So, Fred, what would you say some first steps are for divinity school graduates who are looking for meaningful work in the business world?
Well, many of the things in my book actually address people who are looking for work. And I think it's important that you try to follow your passions in terms of the kind of work you do and do your homework. I mean, I have interviewed hundreds of people over the years, and the ones that stand out to me when I interview them for a job are the ones who did their homework on my company. They understood some of the things I've talked about. I mentioned this in the book. Take a look. Clearly, you got to read the mission and understand the mission and the vision of the company. Almost every company on their website will have a mission statement and maybe a vision statement, or even now it's common to have a statement of purpose. You got to read those things before you even interview, because then you can ask questions, about how are they addressing the mission, and how are they doing in progressing toward a long-term vision. And if you in fact agree with or find their mission compelling, it's something worth saying. I wouldn't say it if it's not true, but if it's true, you definitely want to say that in the interview process. And even looking at the financials in the interview, before the interview, can trigger some meaningful questions. One of the worst things that happens when people interview is you end the interview, you as the interviewer ask them a lot of questions, and you always say, do you have any questions you want to ask me? And it's a very negative sign when they don't have meaningful questions to ask. So be prepared and ask those questions, but follow your passions. One of the things I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned this in the book or not, but people tend to campaign for jobs and titles, and for the wrong reason. They want the job for the title and for the money. And that's the wrong reason. You're going to be happy if you're following your passions in your work. And I actually had the example of, I've told many times, is when I went to New York Life, I sent them a resume and a letter. I didn't even go through a recruiter. And on my resume, I had 12 references. At the end, 2 of them were people that I had previously fired. And they agreed to stand as a reference for me because they later, both of them, I mean, this does not always happen, but in this case, both of them were in the wrong job. I didn't have another job for them. They were miserable. Their health was suffering. Their marriages were suffering, and they were just very unhappy people. And I told them, when we release them, that they really need to find something that's more suitable and they're passionate about. And both of them came back to see me a couple of years later and thanked me for firing them. Now that doesn't happen too often, but it's an example of why, you need to be in the right job and not just go after any job for any purpose, and certainly not for title and money.
Well, this is a related question, but what do you suggest for someone who really doesn't know what career they want to go into? Does this kind of tie back to doing a spiritual gifts assessment to help figure that out? Or?
Yeah, I think it's that. And it's also, think about what makes you happy. Think about what makes time stand still for you. What kind of activities you've been involved in where you really seem to excel. You get compliments from other people. Those are the kinds of things you want to try and find in your work life. Now, you might say, well, I went through college and I didn't think about all those things. But still, a lot of people follow a different path. My son, Zach Kelly, I think you might have known Zach. He wanted to be a photographer, but he couldn't make it work, and he loved photography, but he decided, what, I'm really good at math. I love equations and mechanical stuff. And now he's a mechanical engineer and he's really, really happy, So that's what you got to do, is you got to follow your passions and determine what really, think a lot about, pray about what makes you really come alive and feel happy and fulfilled, and people compliment you on how you do certain things. And that's a path to follow.
So we have a question about, did you ever have to deal with people at New York Life who were actively trying to undermine you, and what principles guided you in how you dealt with that?
Not so much actively undermining, but yeah, there's always a lot of internal competition at a company. When I came into New York Life, I was one of the very, very few outsiders to come in at an executive level. And, I really utilized my staff and my colleagues. I spent a lot of time cultivating their relationships. I'd ask for their advice. The other thing is, I always hired people that I felt were smarter than me. I had big, broad responsibilities, and every person who reported to me knew their business better than I did. I was just there to oversee it and manage it. And I used to tell people, I'm not intimidated by genius. I give it an environment in which to flourish. And that's how I managed at New York Life. And I tried to listen to people. Listening is a wonderful skill. You've got to listen. A couple of tips that I heard from others, strangely enough, presidents of the United States. One was the first George Bush. We used to have them speak at big New York Life sessions, so I'd get a chance to have a dinner or a meal with them. And he said, when asked about leadership, he said one of the most important things to him was to give credit and take blame. Give credit and take blame. And I think that's an important principle. Make sure you're profusely praising those around you. And, when things go wrong, take it upon yourself. Don't be pointing the finger and blaming everybody else. Another one was President Clinton. When I got to go to a White House reception, and when I introduced myself to him and said New York Life, he looked at me and he said, "You're the guy who stole Sandy Kristoff from me," because we had hired Sandy Kristoff as our leading expert on Asian affairs because she was Clinton's expert on China. And we hired her to work in the international division. And I said, yeah, we hired her and she's doing a great job. And he said to me, you know what I loved about Sandy Kristoff was she always told me what I needed to know, not what I wanted to hear. And I thought that was terrific advice because, you know, if you're a bully and you're tearing down people who tell you bad news, there's something wrong with that. They're going to stop telling you what you need to know. And I thought that was very good advice. So, it's things like that that come up in leadership discussions that I think are important.
Yeah. Well, Fred, thank you. We are at 1 o'clock, so we want to be respectful of everyone's time, but thank you for a really, really interesting and informative conversation. And I just want to give everybody a little quick heads up that Megan just dropped a link to Fred's site in the chat if you're looking to go to his site to check out the books or find out more information. But thank you, and thank you everyone for being with us today.
Thank you, Kelly. Appreciate it.